Welcome back to Smitty's Learning Room. Today we're going to have a look at the body in motion and more specifically, the immediate physiological responses to training. These responses are changes that take place within specific body organs and tissues when we exercise. The more we train, the better we are at using our heart and our lungs to transport oxygen around our body in order to produce energy to improve performance. When we start training from a sedentary state or we start increasing our level of activity during training sessions, our body starts to make specific changes to make sure that we get enough oxygen and nutrients to allow our muscles to move and to meet the demands of physical activity. These changes are particularly observable in capacities directly related to performance, including our heart rate, cardiac output, stroke volume, lactate levels, and ventilation rate. We start by having a look at our heart rate, and the definition of a heart rate is the number of times the heart beats per minute, or BPM. The changes that occur in our heart rate are the most easiest to measure. A resting heart rate is often quite slow, and that's measured when we are at complete rest. It's important to understand that everybody's heart rate is different. So someone who leads a sedentary lifestyle of minimal activity will have a completely different resting heart rate to someone who is quite an engaged person in physical activity or someone who is an elite athlete. It's common for someone who is an endurance athlete to have a low resting heart rate because this is indicative of a very efficient cardiovascular system. Heart rate is quite easy to understand. When we increase our exercise, our heart starts beating faster. So when we increase our exercise, we also increase our heart rate. This is known as our working heart rate, and our heart rate increases according to the intensity of our exercise effort. When we move from a period of inactivity to activity, that's when our heart rate increases the most because our body is in demand for oxygen. So for example, when you go for a run, you usually sort of feel you're okay, and then all of a sudden within sort of 30 seconds to say a minute or two, you're really puffing and panting. Then you start to settle in a bit and your heart's getting more efficient and it's used to being able to pump up and supply oxygen to the body. When we start to get that feeling where we're comfortable, that's known as a steady state, which is the period of time during which the oxygen uptake remains at the same level. So if we're running at the same speed or we're swimming at the same speed, we're just using the same amount of oxygen. Obviously, when we compare a fit person to an unfit person's heart rate, when a fit person is exercising, their heart rate is able to stay at a steady state for a much longer period of time than what an unfit person will. It's also important to understand that when exercise is stopped, an athlete who is fit, their heart rate will decline much quicker and go back to the resting heart rate than what an unfit person will. Sometimes this can take up to several hours for them to recover from this activity. When we look at ventilation rate, we're looking at the depth and rate of breathing, and it's expressed in breaths per minute. So when we begin to exercise, the demand for more oxygen by the muscle cells causes the ventilation response. So we know from earlier on in the topic that ventilation has two phases. It has an inspiration where we breathe air into the lungs and an expiration where we breathe air out of the lungs. When we're at rest, our inspiration rates, or our ventilation rate, is usually about 12 breaths per minute, causing the lungs to consume around 500 millilitres of air per breath. When we exercise, this automatically changes our ventilation rate, as we need to have more oxygen to the body to be able to fuel muscles for movement. Our ventilation rate can change before we've even started exercising, as the thoughts or the nervous energy around exercise can often trigger our body to go into panic mode where we might start to change our breathing. Once we start exercising, our ventilation rate and the depth of breathing increases moderately to allow us to have more oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production, triggering an elevated respiratory activity. Similar to heart rate, at the end of exercise, our ventilation rate will slowly start to decline over a period of time. Again, the fitter that we are, the quicker our ventilation rate will go back to 12 breaths per minute. Having a look at stroke volume now. And stroke volume is the amount of blood ejected by the left ventricle of the heart during a contraction. We measure our stroke volume by milliliters per beat. Our stroke volume is determined by the ability to fill our ventricles with blood and the ability to empty the ventricles as a result of ventricular contractions. When we exercise, our stroke volume increases. So the volume of blood which we can empty out from our heart increases when we exercise. Just like ventilation rate, when we initially begin to exercise, that's when we see the greatest change in our stroke volume. Once you get to activity of a high level, there is less change in the stroke volume. Again, there are differences between a fit and an unfit person. So for example, a sedentary person will be able to maintain a stroke volume of 60 to 80 milliliters per beat. However, a well-trained athlete can reach up to 160 milliliters per beat at submaximal workload. So put simply, a sedentary person can only output smaller amounts of blood to the body, which means they're getting less oxygen, which means they fatigue a lot faster than a fit person. A fit person is able to exert higher levels or higher volumes of blood to the muscles at a much more efficient rate, so therefore allowing more oxygen to the muscles for longer periods of time. The reason the stroke volume increases is because the blood returns to the heart at a much quicker rate. And because it's returning quicker, it promotes a more forceful contraction and allows for the complete emptying of the left ventricle with each beat. When we look at the relationship between heart rate and stroke volume, as our heart rate increases, so does our stroke volume. So if we have an increase of our heart rate during exercise, so you'll notice when we look at rest, the heart rate is quite low, and as we work our way up from moderate to maximum amounts of exercise, our heart rate begins to increase. This is similar for the stroke volume. However, after the initial change or increase, we then start to see the stroke volume go steady when we start getting to the submaximal effort of exercise. Obviously, once we stop exercise, that's when both our heart rate and our stroke volume will go back to normal levels or resting levels. Having a look at our cardiac output now. And the cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped by the heart per minute. So just like all the other responses, our cardiac output increases with exercise in the same way as stroke volume. Cardiac output is a product of our heart rate and our stroke volume, and we can calculate it in the following way. So we go cardiac output equals our heart rate times our stroke volume. We express our cardiac output as milliliters per minute. When we are at rest, our cardiac output is directed to our physically inactive muscles, and our muscles use about 20% of our cardiac output at rest. The rest of our cardiac output goes to our heart, our skin, brains, kidneys, liver, and other organs. When we begin to exercise, this changes as our muscles require a lot more oxygen to be able to keep the body moving, so much in fact that it can actually increase our cardiac output to our muscles up to 84%. When we compare untrained people to trained endurance athlete, we look at that untrained people can increase cardiac output to about 22 litres per minute during exercise, and highly trained athletes will have an increase in the vicinity of, say, 35 to 40 litres per minute. The final response we'll have a look at today is lactate levels. Now, lactate is a salt formed from lactic acid that accumulates during intense anaerobic activity. And often we hear the term of, oh, I've got a lactic acid buildup. And that's generally when we start to feel a little bit sick. If we go for a sprint, say more than 200 metres, we'll start to feel quite nauseous. Or when the term where our legs or our arms might start to feel quite heavy, or, we use the term, oh, my legs are smashed. And that's basically when we're looking at the concept that our lactate levels have increased. Lactate is a chemical that's formed during the breakdown of carbohydrates in the absence of sufficient oxygen. So once our body starts moving, after those sort of 10 to 20 seconds of movement, we start getting lactic to form up in our muscles. So even though it's already in our blood, what happens is we get too much lactic acid build up in our muscles, which makes it difficult for our body to resynthesize or turn that lactic acid back in to energy if we don't have oxygen. The LIP is what we call the lactate inflection point, and this is the point beyond which we can no longer maintain using our anaerobic energy system. And that's that time when we start to feel sick or our muscles get heavy. So in short, high levels of lactate are produced when we exercise and there's insufficient oxygen available to the muscle cells. It accumulates quite quickly when we exercise above the lactate inflection point, which is at about 80 to 90% of our maximum heart rate for a trained athlete. Obviously, a non-trained athlete, that lactate inflection point is much lower. If we have increased levels of lactate in our body, it makes it hard for our muscle fibers to contract and work. Hence why we need to have a lot of recovery time between, say, sprint efforts or training sessions that require us to have quite high intensity periods of exercise to enable the aerobic energy system to take over and allow oxygen to come back to the muscles to allow the lactic to be resynthesized and provide energy to the muscles. Because there is always lactic present in the blood, it's important to remember that lactate does not cause fatigue prior to the lactate inflection point. So if we're constantly training below that point, there won't be a buildup of lactate or excess lactate in the muscles, and therefore we won't necessarily experience fatigue within the muscles. When lactate is formed in the muscles, we get a byproduct, which is hydrogen. So we have a lactate ion and a hydrogen ion that is formed in the muscles. It's important to understand that it's actually the hydrogen, not the lactate, that causes an increase in the acidity of blood, and as a consequence makes it difficult for the muscles to function properly. So to wrap things up, we know that training causes immediate physiological responses, and you can see these changes in relation to our heart rate, ventilation rate, stroke volume, cardiac output, and lactate levels. Our heart rate is the number of times the heart beats per minute. When we begin to exercise, our heart rate increases and reaches a steady state during sustained moderate activity such as jogging. The breathing or ventilation rate increases during physical activity to deliver more oxygen to muscles. Stroke volume refers to the amount of blood ejected by the heart during a contraction. It increases significantly in response to exercise. Cardiac output is the amount of blood, or the total amount of blood pumped by the heart per minute, and increases with exercise. When muscles work, blood is drawn from many parts of the body and redistributed to the muscles. Lactate, or lactic acid, increases in the blood during exercise. If exercise is vigorous, lactate increases rapidly and inhibits performance if levels rise too high.